Sometimes history begins not with a war or an empire, but with a sound. The slow, endless percussion of water against stone. They say there was once a time when it never stopped raining. Days melted into centuries, and the earth forgot what dryness meant. Deserts turned to mirror lakes. Mountains blurred behind curtains of vapor. Fossils later told us this storm lasted 2 million years. But fossils never explain why. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you really like what I'm doing here. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. Because tonight, we're going back to the beginning of that rain. To the first horizon that vanished. No one remembers the moment it started. It began as a subtle shift, a thicker scent in the air, a longer wait between dry seasons. Then rivers began to braid into one another until they no longer knew where they ended. Wind carried mist from the equator to the poles. Animals that once followed dust now followed reflection. It was not a flood, not yet. Just a slow submersion of memory. Geologists later named this age with words too clinical to hold its feeling. The pluvial epochs, the long humid chapters of the Pleistocene. But the earth itself must have felt something deeper, as if its lungs were filling with time. Lake beds appeared across the Sahara where no lake should exist. In East Africa, the Olduvai Basin swelled and overflowed again and again, leaving layers of clay that shimmer even now, like the remnants of old mirrors. Every time one of those ancient lakes vanished, another would rise somewhere else, as if the planet were trying to remember its own reflection. To imagine it is to slow your breathing. The air heavy, dense with vapor. No clear horizon, only the sound of droplets falling on endless leaves. The ground became soft, then liquid, and life began to change. The predators grew fewer, their tracks erased by rain before morning. The herbivores became wanderers, learning to eat what floated, what swayed, what refused to drown. Even microbes, unseen architects of survival, began to evolve into shapes that could endure oxygen-poor worlds. Somewhere between these clouds, our ancestors moved too. The early hominins of the Rift Valley, the ones who walked but did not yet think in words, found themselves surrounded by water they could neither drink nor escape. The rain that promised life began to wash away their world. Some fossils show a strange pause here, a silence in the record. Fewer tools, fewer bones, a missing chapter. It was as though humanity blinked, and the earth turned the page before we opened our eyes again. What happened in that blink? Some scientists blame orbital cycles, the slow wobble of Earth's axis known as the Milankovitch rhythm. Others point to volcanic chains that altered the carbon balance, drawing heat from the sky and turning the atmosphere into a mirror that trapped its own tears. Yet, every theory leaves a hollow in its center. Something unspoken, as if the planet herself had decided to withhold an answer. It's a strange thought, that water could both erase and preserve. In the caves of Kenya and the limestone ridges of Morocco, we find stones etched not by hands, but by the insistence of rain. Tiny grooves, parallel and deliberate, like the first attempt at writing. If language is a record against forgetting, then maybe this was where it began. Not in firelight, but in the slow handwriting of weather. Under the endless gray, colors changed meaning. The sky lost its blue. Trees shed their leaves not because of cold, but because they could no longer breathe. The soil soured, releasing the scent of iron and sulfur. But even as decay spread, something curious happened. Seeds that would have died in drought began to thrive. Ferns, mosses, and reeds conquered the continents, holding the ground together like threads of green memory. For 2 million years, The planet learned the art of waiting, and when the waiting became unbearable, the first signs of resistance appeared. Certain birds began to use rain as a tool, tapping worms from the ground with the rhythm of drops. Some mammals evolved fur that repelled water with invisible oils. Insects sealed their wings like parchment to survive long seasons of storms. Adaptation was no longer a choice. It was a language of endurance written into every genome. Yet, beneath the calm rhythm of survival, there was always loss. Fire disappeared. Lightning flashed, but nothing caught. The warmth that had once gathered tribes around embers was gone. The world entered its longest night, and in that night, memory itself began to dissolve. Imagine a world where even stars were veiled, where direction was rumor, and the only constant was the whisper of falling water. At some point, maybe after the first 100,000 years, rain ceased to be noticed. Life adjusted its heartbeat to the rhythm. Bones evolved denser, lungs larger, eyes wider to catch what little light broke through the clouds. This was not adaptation for progress. It was surrender. Quiet and absolute. Survival, in this age, meant to blend with the gray. But every surrender leaves behind a question. What keeps life alive when all symbols of hope, light, warmth, flame, have been erased? Perhaps endurance itself is a kind of faith, older than religion, deeper than science. Not belief in something, but belief through something. The quiet trust that the rain will one day end. Modern science tries to trace this faith through data, in layers of diatom shells, in isotopic ratios, in the magnetic orientations frozen in clay. Every stratum is a diary of water. We can read temperature, mineral content, even wind direction. But nowhere can we read fear. Nowhere can we read how it felt to be alive beneath the endless rain. That is the missing line. The one written not in sediment, but in silence. And so, we look back and wonder, if the sky once fell for 2 million years, and yet life endured, what else have we forgotten about endurance? Could it be that evolution is not the triumph of strength, but the art of waiting through the storm? The horizon that vanished in that age of rain may never return. But perhaps it never truly left, only sank beneath layers of water and time, waiting for us to remember. Outside, wherever you are now, there may be a soft drizzle against your window, a repetition of something ancient, the same rhythm that carried our beginnings through the flood. Listen closely. It might be the oldest sound in the world, and somewhere, under all that falling water, something small and stubborn was still alive. It didn't fight. It didn't flee. It just waited. And by waiting, it became the ancestor of everything that breathes. The first horizon vanished in silence. But in that silence, life learned the shape of forever. They say continents move so slowly that we should not notice. But what if, beneath 2 million years of rain, even continents began to breathe differently? When the world was drenched without end, mountains softened. Valleys deepened into wombs of clay. The planet's crust, burdened by the weight of oceans above and rivers below, flexed like a living lung. What had once been land became water. What had once been desert became reflection. Perhaps the earth, under so much rain, began to remember that it too was mostly water. At first, the transformation seemed small. An inland stream swelling a little farther each season. A delta losing its edge to silt. A cliff face vanishing grain by grain. But when measured in centuries, those small changes became revolutions. Ancient coastlines disappeared. Riverbeds twisted into spirals visible only from the eyes of birds. The landscapes we now call ancient were once as young as a breath. Then, came the drowning. In Africa, the Olduvai Basin filled with layers of mud so fine they preserved the prints of insects. In Asia, the Siwalik Hills recorded the same rain in parallel lines of sediment, as though the two continents shared a single heartbeat. The fossils in those layers reveal an ecosystem neither jungle nor savanna, something between, a perpetual dusk of wet grass and shallow pools. And within that twilight, something extraordinary began to stir. Life adapted not by invention, but by patience. Hippos appeared where once were plains. Elephants grew smaller, more efficient in the soft terrain. Early hominins shifted their diets to include mollusks and aquatic plants, learning to wade and gather. It wasn't evolution by dominance. It was evolution by surrender. Those who yielded survived. Those who resisted disappeared quietly, without fossils to remember them. When we look at the sediment layers today, we see delicate alternations, bands of light clay, dark silt, then clay again. To geologists, these are signals of changing rainfall, the Earth's old pulse written in color. But between those lines lies another story. In some cores, extracted from the East African rift, there is an abrupt thickening, as if the planet inhaled more deeply for a time. Scientists call it the Olduvai wet phase. It lasted a few 100,000 years, a blink, geologically speaking, but long enough to alter the path of everything that walked, flew, or rooted in that region. Even tectonics responded. Heavy rain carved so deeply into the surface that pressure shifted. Subtle weight redistributions triggered distant quakes, opening fault lines, birthing lakes. The African continent began its slow division, one half pulling away from the other like a great breath. In that sense, the rain didn't just sculpt valleys. It sculpted destiny. Without those fractures, there might never have been a Rift Valley. No highlands to cradle our ancestors. No elevated dry refuge, from which the first migrations could begin when the storms finally eased. The question, of course, is why it rained at all. Why so long, so persistently? The data tells part of the story. Orbital eccentricity, precession, axial tilt. These cosmic metronomes shift sunlight unevenly, stirring monsoons and melting glaciers. But numbers don't explain the feeling. The suffocating abundance that drenched half the world, while the other half froze. Some climatologists suspect a chain of volcanic winters, ash-darkened skies that cooled the air, changing pressure gradients until rain could not stop. Others see the fingerprints of ocean currents, El Niño patterns magnified to a planetary scale. And yet, despite all the explanations, the symmetry remains unsettling. Almost every continent bears evidence of those same humid centuries, as though guided by a rhythm larger than climate. Some ancient myths hint at it in their own way. The Sumerian tablets describing skies that poured without mercy. The Tamil Sangam texts mourning lands lost to the sea. The Aboriginal Dreamtime stories of the long, wet sleep. These stories don't name years or epochs. They speak in memory's language, the sound of the world, inhaling. When we read those myths beside sediment records, something uncanny happens. The data and the stories begin to overlap, not in detail, but in feeling. Perhaps the people who told those tales were remembering more than cultural floods. Perhaps they carried echoes of the real pluvial, the ancestral fear of skies that never cleared. If so, then history itself began not in fire, but in water. Imagine an early human standing on a ridge that used to be desert, now staring at a valley of shining lakes. To them, the world must have seemed reversed. What was solid had become liquid. What was familiar had become reflection. Maybe that confusion was the birthplace of wonder. Maybe curiosity, the root of thought itself, began as disbelief in the landscape. There are fossils of fish found thousands of kilometers inland, in what are now arid regions. Their presence is not surprising. The Earth has drowned itself many times. But among those fossils are subtle anomalies. Bone isotopes showing cycles of drought alternating with deluge, each rhythm accelerating faster than the last. Something in the planet was becoming impatient. Each wet cycle shorter, more intense, more unpredictable. The Earth was learning chaos as continents shifted and new mountains rose. The global wind belts reoriented. Moisture that once belonged to one ocean now fell on another. The Himalayas, then much younger, became a wall that redirected monsoons southward. That deflection may have decided the fate of human evolution. While most creatures perished or retreated, a few hominins found refuge in microclimates, high plateaus where rain softened to mist. There, they learned endurance. They learned waiting. Perhaps they even learned memory. Somewhere within those mists, early humans began to shape tools not just for survival, but for meaning. Stones smoothed by floodwaters became hand axes, symbols of continuity amid dissolution. A chipped flint held the record of persistence. Every mark was a quiet rebellion against erosion. Even as rivers erased footprints, the handprint remained. The first argument against oblivion. And yet, the landscape continued to move. What is now the Red Sea was once a plain of rivers. What is now the Mediterranean was a valley of salt. The rain filled them, emptied them, filled them again, like a slow experiment in amnesia. Continents exhaled, seas inhaled. The Earth's breathing reshaped itself. When scientists map these shifts through satellite imagery, they find patterns too deliberate to seem accidental. Spiral deltas, fractal drainage networks, the recurring geometry of veins. The planet, in its long damp trance, began to resemble the body that would one day walk upon it. Arteries of water mirrored arteries of blood. The macrocosm rehearsed its microcosm. Life was being designed from the ground up, sculpted not by intention, but by the patience of pressure. It's almost unbearable to imagine how slow it felt. Rain for lifetimes. No sunrise unbroken by clouds. The sound of dripping on cave roofs as steady as a heartbeat. In that monotony, perhaps the first awareness arose, not of self, but of time. To endure repetition is to know duration. To know duration is to sense mortality. The rain, in that way, was the planet's first teacher. We live now in the ruins of those lessons. Every mountain ridge, every canyon, every layer of shale that folds upon itself like pages soaked and dried, each is a memory of that breathing earth. And if we listen closely, we can almost hear it still inhaling beneath us. The crust shifts. The faults whisper. And somewhere deep within, molten stone moves with the slow rhythm of tides. The continents are still breathing. The rain only changed its shape. And when the next drop falls, whether on your window or on the floor of an ancient cave, it carries within it a fragment of that endless cycle. The same molecule, perhaps, that once touched the face of the first creature who dared to look up and wait for the clouds to clear. But the clouds never truly cleared. They just learned to hide in time. There is a moment in the long sleep of rain when the world becomes nothing but sound. Before words, before names, there was only the pulse of falling water. It filled the silence of valleys and skulls alike. It echoed in bones, in hollow trees, in the lungs of creatures that learned to breathe damp air. When we think of survival, we imagine strength. But in those 2 million years, survival meant listening. The creatures that endured were those who learned to move with the rhythm of rain, to sleep when it softened, to wake when it roared. In the fossil beds of East Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, paleontologists find evidence of sudden evolutionary turns. Bones slightly altered, skulls reshaped, ear canals refined. The inner ear of early mammals began to specialize, capable of perceiving lower frequencies, the deep resonance of storms. Some even argue that this was the beginning of music, not as art, but as necessity. To detect the tone of rainfall was to know when to seek shelter, when to move, when to wait. Sound became a form of memory. In caves near the Awash River, researchers discovered traces of habitation during the pluvial eras. Among the layers of silt were shells, seeds, fragments of bone, and patterns etched faintly into the walls. Some lines resemble ripples, others parallel drops, like attempts to record the rhythm of the sky. They are among the oldest symbols we know, and perhaps the first that weren't meant to describe shape but sound. To carve rain is to confess listening. When light vanished behind permanent clouds, color faded from the world. Greens dulled to slate. The horizon melted into fog. But sound sharpened. A single branch cracking could mean the difference between life and death. The distant roll of thunder became prophecy. The creatures of this age, giant ground sloths, ancient elephants, early hominins, did not only hear, they felt vibration. In that constant acoustic ocean, awareness deepened. Perhaps that is how consciousness grew, through rhythm, not reason. And if consciousness began as sound, then rain was its first teacher. Each drop a syllable, each storm a sentence, each silence a pause that taught meaning. Modern neuroscientists studying auditory learning have noted that repetition under stress accelerates pattern recognition. Imagine that principle stretched across geological time. The brain learning to find calm in monotony, to see continuity in chaos. The rain didn't just shape bodies, it sculpted thought. Among the ancient species, there was one small ape whose survival depended not on claws or fangs, but on its ability to read the world through sound. We call them Homo habilis now, the tool makers. Yet before stone, before fire, they used listening as their craft. Fossil skulls show a delicate balance between forward-placed eyes and enlarged auditory canals, suggesting a creature always alert, always poised between fear and curiosity. In such a world, the rain was both cradle and cage. Food was abundant yet fleeting. Shelter was fragile. Those who lived learned patience. They nested near rising waters, watching how the land breathed beneath floods. When rivers carved new channels overnight, they moved, not resisting, but following. Their migrations became fluid, seasonal, almost tidal. Anthropologists studying those ancient tracks note how the paths of early hominins mirrored the drainage basins themselves. As if humanity's first instinct was to imitate rivers. It is said that memory begins with return, the act of leaving and coming back. Rain, by erasing every footprint, forced the first memories into being. To survive, creatures had to remember what could no longer be seen. That might explain why the hippocampus, the part of our brain linked to navigation and memory, grew so rapidly during this epoch. It was trained not by maps, but by absence. Even the smallest details suggest this strange apprenticeship to rain. Fossil pollen, trapped in ancient muds, reveals shifts in plant species tied to cyclic wetness. Some plants evolved waxy coatings to survive submersion. Others developed buoyant seeds carried by water for miles. Every adaptation spoke the same language. Endurance through transformation. It is the same law that governs thought. When overwhelmed, change form. When silenced, Listen, somewhere deep in that wet silence, life discovered reflection. Not metaphorical reflection, but literal. Pools forming mirrors. Animals began to see themselves for the first time. There are primates today who react to their reflection with confusion or curiosity. Perhaps that instinct is ancient. In a world of endless water, the first glimpse of one's own image might have been terrifying. A ghost staring back. Yet that vision may have planted the earliest seed of identity. To recognize oneself is to imagine continuity, and continuity is the foundation of survival. And what of the others? The countless species that vanished without trace. For every survivor, there were hundreds that could not adapt to sound and shadow. The fossil record is full of absences. We name them extinctions, but the truth is softer. They were the pauses between notes, the silences that allowed the melody of life to continue. Evolution, like rain, composes through subtraction. In some archaeological layers, the pattern of habitation stops abruptly. Then, centuries later, it resumes, as if the inhabitants returned when the world remembered to rest. That rhythm, appearance, disappearance, reappearance, is the signature of the pluvial age. It's not extinction or birth, but oscillation. Everything waited for the next lull in the storm. Modern researchers have drilled deep cores into ancient lakebeds to study these oscillations. The data shows alternating isotopic signatures, periods of freshwater expansion followed by evaporation. These oscillations coincide eerily with shifts in early human cranial capacity. As climates fluctuated, so did minds. Stability breeds comfort. Chaos breeds creativity. The rain's inconsistency may have been the spark that pushed intelligence forward, not out of ambition, but out of the necessity to predict the unpredictable. Even today, when we fall asleep to the sound of rain, something ancient stirs inside us. Our breathing slows to match the rhythm of drops. Our hearts mimic the steady percussion. We are not just comforted, we are remembered. The body recognizes an old code. Perhaps it is not nostalgia for childhood, but for prehistory, when every night was a storm and survival meant listening. In the oldest floodplains of the Nile, there are thin strata of burnt clay, preserved like punctuation marks between deluges. They mark the brief intervals when fire was possible. Archaeologists find charred bone, pigment stains, and half-melted stones. Evidence of gatherings, of light. Between the long epochs of wetness, there were small awakenings, brief attempts to reclaim the sky. Maybe the rain paused just long enough for someone to look up and wonder whether the clouds would ever part. No record tells us what they thought, but the silence itself feels deliberate. The creatures that listened most deeply left no words, only echoes in our DNA. A pattern of patience, a memory of rhythm, a sensitivity to change. Even now, the way we turn toward sound in darkness, the way our skin feels the pressure before a storm, that is their legacy. The rain did not just shape the earth, it shaped the listener. It tuned the mind toward pattern and pause, toward the unseen relationship between repetition and meaning. In that sense, the 2 million years of rain were not a punishment, nor a trial. They were rehearsal. And when the clouds finally broke, when the first shard of light returned to the drowned horizon, something in life had changed forever. From that endless listening emerged awareness, a quiet intelligence tuned to the pulse of the planet. The creatures that learned to listen became the ones who would later speak. But before speech came silence. And in that silence, rain was the only voice. Fire is an act of defiance against water. And during the age of endless rain, defiance could not live. Across continents, the sky wept on every spark. Lightning struck but found no tinder. Warmth rose, but died before breath could feed it. The world entered a season without flame, and in that cold and constant damp, even the memory of light began to fade. Fossilized soils from this period are almost sterile of charcoal, the black signature that marks burning. Archaeologists studying these sterile layers note an eerie absence, a gap in combustion stretching thousands of years. It was as though the planet itself had forgotten how to burn. To imagine that silence is to unlearn everything we know about survival. For early humans, fire was not yet a metaphor. It was a fragile companion. It dried skins, hardened tools, warded off predators. It turned raw into edible, night into home. Its loss must have felt like exile. And yet, for millennia, no flame could survive the rain's insistence. When sparks died, the dark closed in, not instantly, but gradually, like fog overtaking thought. Sediment cores taken from the East African rift show alternating bands of ash and clay until, abruptly, the ash disappears. It does not return for nearly 100,000 years. This is not coincidence. It is evidence of extinction's quiet kind, the loss not of species, but of comfort. Cultures that once gathered around warmth scattered or dwindled. The archaeologist's trowel finds no hearths, no soot, no signal of story. Only damp stone and silence. What happens to a mind when the night never ends? Some anthropologists speculate that in these long ages of shadow, vision itself began to adapt. Eyes widened, pupils dilated. The threshold between darkness and light became porous. The human retina, more sensitive than most primates, may have been honed during this gloom. In perpetual twilight, perception sharpened inward. We began to see not through brightness, but through movement, the shimmer of rain, the shift of branches, the pulse of lightning before it struck. Survival became the art of subtlety. There are myths, scattered across continents, that whisper of this long extinguishing. Polynesian legends of a wet night, when God stole the flame from men. Finnish epics that speak of a time when the rain ate the sun. In South America's oldest oral traditions, fire is a fugitive, hidden inside trees and stones until a hero learns how to coax it back. These stories, separated by oceans and millennia, share one theme: the loss of warmth as divine punishment or cosmic test. But perhaps they're not myths at all. Perhaps they are inherited memories, encoded laments for that epoch when the world was too wet to burn. When heat disappeared, hunger followed. Without fire, preservation was impossible. Food rotted before it could be consumed. Protein spoiled. Fats melted into rancid film. In that decay, nature began to recycle itself faster than creatures could adapt. Yet even within this desolation, life refused to end. Mushrooms spread like thought, feasting on decomposition. Amphibians flourished, their slick skins merging with the rhythm of the rain. The planet turned green with refusal, ferns unrolling like manuscripts of persistence. The rain, unrelenting, became both destroyer and midwife. And what of the humans, or almost humans, who endured it? They could not keep flame alive, but they kept its idea. Some archaeologists believe this was when symbolic thought began to deepen, forced inward by deprivation. With no fire to gather around, imagination became the hearth. Caves turned to cathedrals of silence where light was memory, not matter. There, in darkness, our ancestors painted, not to be seen, but to remember sight itself. The pigments they used, ochre, hematite, manganese, came from minerals altered by water. To mix them was to borrow color from rain. In that way, every early painting was an act of alchemy, turning moisture into memory, loss into permanence. The absence of fire made the need for preservation urgent. Perhaps this is when storytelling began, not as entertainment, but as survival. Words were the new sparks, passed from mouth to mouth in the dark. Science sees the same pattern reflected in DNA. Geneticists tracing mitochondrial lineages find population bottlenecks that coincide with pluvial intervals. Entire groups reduced to fragments, then reborn. It is as if humanity's inheritance includes not just endurance, but the memory of near erasure. Each of us carries within ourselves the ghost of the age when the world was too wet for warmth. Maybe that's why the sound of rain feels both calming and sad. It reminds something ancient inside us of the night we almost didn't survive. Still, the mystery remains. How did warmth return? What ended the long extinguishing? Some point to volcanic eruptions that pierced the clouds, spreading ash that finally dimmed rainfall. Others speak of orbital shifts that altered the planet's tilt, restoring balance. But a few researchers, reading deep sea cores, see something stranger. In the Atlantic's abyssal sediments, there appears a sudden spike in black carbon, a fingerprint of global combustion. It is as if the planet relit itself all at once. Could it be that the absence of fire prepared the world for renewal? That the Earth, saturated with memory, reached a saturation point where flame became inevitable? It's a poetic notion, but nature often follows such paradoxes. Drought follows flood. Light grows from darkness. Fire waits in the womb of water. Even after warmth returned, the memory of the long rain remained. Myths began to divide time into two eras, before the loss and after the return. Prometheus, in Greek memory, is not just a thief of fire. He is the restorer of memory itself, the reminder that warmth can be stolen, but not destroyed. In Hindu cosmology, Agni hides in the waters before being born again. In every tradition, flame rises from drowning. Perhaps these are not coincidences, but recollections encoded in story. The human way of marking when the world exhaled again. Modern climatologists studying those epochs find a peculiar symmetry in temperature graphs. The curve of humidity mirrors the curve of human expansion. When the world was wettest, population shrank. When it dried, they spread. Civilization, it seems, is built on evaporation. But what we forget is that the foundation of that cycle was loss. Without the long extinction of warmth, there might never have been the craving that built culture. Desire, like flame, needs absence to exist. To think of that age now is to imagine the impossible. A planet without fire. No lightning igniting grasslands. No stars visible through clouds. No smell of smoke. Just the ceaseless breath of rain and the low hum of life remembering what it once had. Even the Earth's core, deep beneath our feet, must have felt the weight of that silence. But pressure has its own patience. Beneath every extinguished surface, something was waiting to ignite, and maybe that's the secret of endurance. Not to resist the flood, but to keep a spark hidden somewhere beyond reach. To let the rain fall as it must, knowing that warmth can vanish for millennia and still find its way back. The disappearance of fire was not the end of light. It was its gestation. And when the first dry wind finally crossed the soaked continents, carrying dust instead of mist, the waiting world inhaled and remembered how to burn. But what if that return was not the planet's choice? What if something else, unseen beneath the waters, decided the moment was right to relight the sky? We still don't know who or what held the match. Maps are memories of the solid world, and during the 2 million years of rain, even memory began to melt. The lines that once divided land from water blurred into watercolor ghosts. Rivers braided and unbraided until their paths became indecipherable. The ancient cartographers of nature, the winds, the tides, the tectonic scars, lost their orientation. In that age, there were no continents, only continents in waiting, drifting beneath a veil of storm. The Earth's face, if seen from above, would have been unrecognizable. A gray sphere wrapped in vapor, its boundaries trembling like breath on glass. When the rain first began, lakes grew in every basin, carving new outlines into the crust. But as centuries turned to epochs, those outlines refused to stay still. Valleys flooded, ridges drowned, then resurfaced somewhere else entirely. Landmarks became unreliable. Direction lost meaning. For the creatures that lived through this time, navigation was no longer horizontal, but instinctive, measured by scent, sound, and pressure. The planet had no map, only memory, and even that memory was dissolving. Today, we find traces of these vanished geographies in the subtlest places. Marine fossils discovered hundreds of miles inland, dunes buried beneath layers of silt, coral limestone forming the foundations of mountains. In the Sahara, radar imaging reveals the ghosts of ancient river systems, the Taman Rasset, the Irharhar, the Sahabi, rivers that once rivaled the Amazon, now entombed beneath sand. Their courses twist like forgotten sentences. These are not dry scars. They are erased words, fragments of a conversation the earth once had with its own rain. What makes this discovery haunting is not that such rivers existed, but that they existed repeatedly. Every few 100,000 years, the planet redrew itself. Each pluvial phase brought new floods, and each recession left behind new deserts. The world was not destroyed. It was rewritten. And in the long pauses between those rewritings, early humans appeared, witnesses to a shifting story they could never finish reading. Archaeologists working in North Africa find artifacts scattered across layers of mudstone and sand. Stone tools polished smooth by water, engraved bones warped by compression. The same hand axes appear in multiple strata, as if entire generations returned to the same places long after they'd been drowned. It suggests a deep pattern. Humanity's instinct to rebuild memory even as the landscape erases it. We have always been archivists of impermanence. One particular discovery, often overlooked, may hold a clue to that vanished orientation. In the limestone caves of southern Europe, researchers found pieces of carved bone etched with faint, repetitive marks. They resemble ripples, perhaps the artist's attempt to record the rhythm of waves, or perhaps rainfall itself. But alongside these ripples are other lines, curving and intersecting like primitive maps. When digitally reconstructed, they form shapes eerily similar to coastlines that no longer exist. Could it be that the first maps were not of nations or trade routes, but of loss? Attempts to fix the unfixable, to hold water in geometry. Imagine a people who never saw the same horizon twice. One generation grows up beside a lake. Their children grow up in a desert where that lake once shimmered. Their grandchildren build shelters on an island rising from its dust. Continuity becomes myth. Perhaps that's why so many flood legends, from Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica, speak not only of destruction, but of remembrance. The flood erases the world, and yet it also renews it. Each retelling is a way to redraw the map, to remind ourselves that orientation is temporary. The loss of the map was also the loss of certainty. When direction disappeared, imagination took its place. Without coordinates, the human mind turned inward, inventing metaphysical geography, heavens above, underworlds below, paths of souls and rivers of forgetting. The rain that dissolved boundaries on earth gave birth to boundaries in myth. What could not be found physically was remade symbolically. In that sense, theology may have begun as cartography of the unseen. Scientific evidence hints that the first symbolic markings, spirals, zigzags, and concentric circles, coincide with these long pluvial periods. To live amid constant transformation is to crave order, to draw meaning where none can stay. Perhaps those markings were the earliest attempts to stabilize perception, a hand's resistance to the world's fluidity. Even now, when a child draws waves, they are unknowingly repeating the oldest gesture on earth, the attempt to remember water's shape. But memory, like water, always escapes. When the rain intensified, entire lowlands vanished. The Baltic became a sea. The Mediterranean filled from the Atlantic in a single cataclysmic event called the Zanclean Flood, when a wall of water roared through Gibraltar and drowned an entire basin. Some scientists believe echoes of that moment linger in human mythology. The Great Flood of Gilgamesh, the Deluge of Deucalion, the rising seas of Aboriginal songlines. Each culture inherited the same trembling memory. The day the map ceased to make sense, and yet, within that erasure lay possibility. Islands rose as refuges. Highlands turned to sanctuaries. Isolation, though cruel, created diversity. When boundaries melt, life divides and begins anew. Evolution loves confusion. The lost map became the blueprint of renewal. Still, one question remains. How did early humans keep track of home when the land itself refused to stay still? Some theories propose that memory shifted from geography to story, that narrative replaced location. Instead of saying, "We live beyond the river," they said, "We live where the heron returns after the storm." Landmarks became temporal rather than spatial, defined by rhythm instead of distance. The earliest myths, then, were not explanations of the world, but coordinates of belonging. You can sense that transformation in language itself. Words for rain, river, and time share common roots in dozens of ancient tongues. To speak of water was to speak of duration. In Proto-Indo-European, the root up meant both water and flowing. The same word birthed aqua, apa, awa, and later, away. Even linguistically, to move away is to move like water. Language remembers what geography forgets. Somewhere in the sedimentary layers of the Nile Delta, there lies a thin band of gray clay containing flecks of obsidian and red pigment. It dates to a brief dry interlude during the long rain. The pigment appears deliberately mixed, as if someone had been sketching on a surface long since washed away. When analyzed under infrared light, the strokes form a curved pattern, almost like the outline of a coast. Perhaps it was the map of a memory, a line drawn not to guide, but to mourn. Modern satellites now trace those ancient shorelines hidden beneath dunes, and in doing so, we rediscover what the Earth itself forgot. Every discovery feels like déjà vu, as though our instruments are recalling what our bodies once knew, that land and water are only temporary disguises of the same motion. The map never vanished. It just sank beneath us, and maybe that is the true meaning of erosion. Not destruction, but remembrance made fluid. What we call loss might be the planet's way of keeping secrets moving. If so, then every coastline today is only a pause. Every border a reflection that will one day shift again. Under the ceaseless rain, the world learned to forget in order to continue. And we, the inheritors of that forgetting, still draw maps, Lines on paper trying to hold still what has never stopped moving. But when the next long rain comes, and it will, what will be left to erase? Perhaps not land or ocean this time, but the very image of certainty. Perhaps the next map to melt will be the one inside the mind. And when that happens, what direction will memory take? If the rain taught life to listen, it also taught the sky to fall silent. There were centuries when thunder disappeared, not because lightning ceased, but because the air grew too thick to echo. The clouds pressed so close to the ground that sound itself seemed smothered. The earth entered a state of muffled twilight, a long breath between pulses. Scientists studying ancient ice cores from Antarctica have found microscopic layers that record this hush. Drops in airborne dust, spikes in trapped water vapor, traces of volcanic aerosols that dimmed sunlight for millennia. To them, these lines mark climate variation. To the imagination, they are the measure of silence itself. In that dense, wet stillness, oxygen levels fluctuated wildly. The atmosphere became a filter of its own light. Raindrops captured particles of ash and sulfur, scattering them like prisms. Days glowed not blue, but silver. Nights were unbroken, the horizon glowing faintly, as if the sun were trying to remember where it belonged. Creatures that depended on clear skies, birds, insects, early nomads, found their navigation confused. Without stars, there was no direction. Without dry air, there was no distance. The world became a room without windows. From this era, we inherit a geological enigma. A faint gray line that appears in sediments worldwide, signaling what geologists call a low excitation interval. The phrase sounds mechanical, but what it describes is emotional. It means the planet stopped responding to itself. Weather patterns stalled. Winds fell still. Lightning's frequency dropped to a fraction of its previous rhythm. Even photosynthesis slowed, choked by veiled light. Imagine a planet holding its breath. Some climatologists trace this pause to a series of colossal volcanic eruptions near what is now Indonesia. Their ash clouds circling the equator, reflecting sunlight back into space. Others point to methane releases from thawing permafrost that thickened the air until it absorbed its own heat. But every explanation feels like an apology for something deeper. The sense that the Earth itself withdrew. Perhaps it wasn't exhaustion but protection. A planetary reflex against the violence of its own cycles. In the absence of wind and flame, another rhythm began to dominate. The slow, eternal descent of rain. The sound became everything. The voice of the world talking to itself. Over centuries, water carved its language into stone. Scientists who study karst formations, stalactites and stalagmites, can now read those lines like diaries. Each ring of calcite records not just rainfall, but sound, vibration frozen in mineral form. There are patterns that resemble musical notation, cycles of wet and dry transcribed into the architecture of caves. In that sense, even when the sky fell silent, the earth kept singing beneath it. To imagine those eons is to imagine a world with no sharpness. Nothing cracked, nothing burned. The color of day was always gray, the color of night the same. Early humans who lived through this age must have known the strange melancholy of uniformity. Some of their tools, stone flakes shaped so delicately they seem ornamental, bear no evidence of use. Perhaps they were not weapons or instruments, but prayers, gestures of movement in a motionless world. There is a psychological term, sensory deprivation, describing what happens when the brain is starved of contrast. In modern experiments, people placed in soundless rooms begin to hallucinate after hours. During those 2 million years of rain, the planet itself was the chamber. Perhaps consciousness expanded in that deprivation, forced inward by monotony, dreaming to replace what eyes could no longer distinguish. The mind, like light, diffused evidence from brain endocasts, fossilized impressions of skull interiors, shows an increase in the frontal lobe volume of early Homo species around this time. Some paleoneurologists argue this growth correlates with abstract thought. When the external world fell silent, internal landscapes awakened. Imagination may have been born not in sunlight, but in fog. Still, silence carries weight. With every drop that fell, oxygen diminished a little more. Forests, once vibrant, began to collapse under their own humidity. Swamps turned acidic. Decomposition slowed to a crawl. In those stagnant wetlands, methane gathered, rising in invisible veils. It was not just a quiet world. It was a breathless one. The air grew heavy enough to alter the shape of life itself. Insects developed smaller wings to resist waterlogged flight. Mammals shrank to minimize energy loss. What we now call microfauna, frogs, rodents, small reptiles, became the hidden monarchs of the age. The giants of prehistory were gone. The whisperers had inherited the earth. Even light changed its nature. The sky's diffusion turned sunlight into something tactile, almost fluid. Some minerals, when exposed to that filtered glow, began to glow faintly in return. A phenomenon known today as thermoluminescence. Certain cave crystals still emit it when struck by air after thousands of years. It is not true light, but memory of light, a faint echo stored in matter. The silence of the sky taught even rocks to remember brightness. If we listen to the data too long, it begins to sound like scripture. Every spike in carbon isotopes, every lull in sulfur traces, every trapped bubble of ancient air, all speak of repetition and restraint. The planet was not dying. It was meditating. Life contracted, rebalanced, redefined its scale. It's possible that the human sense of humility, our awe before vastness, was imprinted here. When you live under a sky that refuses to answer, reverence becomes instinct. At some point, perhaps after millennia of stillness, the clouds began to thin. The first winds returned like hesitant ghosts. Pollen appeared again in lake sediments. The Earth's metabolism stirred, but the silence didn't vanish completely. It retreated into the background, a permanent undertone of existence. Even now, between storms, you can feel it. That low pause before thunder, the weight in the air just before sound returns. It is the world remembering its own hush. Some myths preserve this moment of almost rebirth. In Japanese cosmology, the goddess Izanami descends into a realm of perpetual mist, where breath itself becomes invisible. In Norse myth, after the Great Flood, the first wind is said to carry the whispers of the drowned. And in the Mayan Popol Vuh, creation begins not with noise, but with silence. The sky was calm, the sea quiet. No sound disturbed the heart of darkness. These are not coincidences. They are geological memories disguised as theology, the collective echo of an age when silence ruled everything. Even science, in its most precise language, struggles to name that rule. Some researchers call it the quiet sun hypothesis, referring to periods when solar activity diminishes, reducing cosmic radiation and therefore atmospheric energy. But there's a poetry hidden in that phrase. Quiet sun. A star resting, dreaming perhaps, while its planets hold their breath. During those epochs, Earth was not abandoned. It was cradled in stillness, To understand that stillness is to glimpse a truth about existence itself, that growth sometimes requires pause, that evolution advances through waiting. The silence of the sky was not absence, it was gestation. In the same way that sleep renews the mind, that silence was the planet's way of remembering itself. When the first true winds returned, scattering the fog, they must have sounded deafening after so many centuries of quiet. Imagine that roar, like the breath of resurrection. Every creature must have stopped and listened. Perhaps some instinct told them that life had survived its longest meditation. But silence never truly ends. It simply moves deeper, finding new chambers to hide in. Inside stone, inside DNA, inside thought. And maybe that's why, when we stand beneath heavy clouds before a storm, we hold our breath without knowing why. Some ancient memory rises, the inheritance of those who lived through the hush. The silence of the sky is not gone. It's only sleeping, waiting for its next long rain. When the rain finally began to thin, the world was no longer one. The endless gray retreated in fragments, uncovering peaks and plateaus like islands rising from a drowned dream. Those highlands became sanctuaries, the last dry lungs of a planet still learning to breathe again. Across epochs, these fragments of land formed an archipelago of survival. And from them, new life began to emerge, shy and deliberate, blinking at a brightness it had almost forgotten. Scientists now call this stage the interpluvial intervals. But names cannot capture the strangeness of a world remembering how to see. After millennia of uniform cloud, sunlight was not gentle. It returned in shards, fractured through haze, gilding everything it touched with a violent clarity. The sudden contrast must have been unbearable, the way a sleeper flinches when curtains are pulled open. But where light returned, imagination followed. On the Ethiopian highlands, the volcanic plateaus of Kenya, and the ancient Galapagos-like islands that rose in the Indian Ocean, isolation gave birth to invention. The evolutionary record from these regions shows an explosion of diversity that has puzzled biologists for decades. Species that once shared the same ancestor diverged wildly within a few thousand generations. Giant rodents, dwarf elephants, birds that lost their wings and learned to run, mammals that grew gills to feed in flooded plains, then lost them again when the water receded. The rain had not destroyed creation. It had divided it so that it could learn to imagine itself anew. In that mosaic of climates, humanity too was fragmented. Populations separated by mountain ranges and inland seas evolved along their own quiet trajectories. Fossil DNA from sites across Africa shows genetic patterns like fingerprints of islands, distinct yet faintly echoing one another. The pluvial ages, once thought to have slowed human evolution, may have accelerated it through separation. The storm had become a teacher of individuality, but isolation carries a cost. Each island, each refuge, became a small world bound by its own rules. To survive, creatures adapted not just to environment, but to solitude. Communication itself had to evolve. The first signs of symbolic behavior, ornamental shells, pigment use, rhythmic markings, appear in these regions. Perhaps the urge to decorate, to make pattern, arose from loneliness. When no other tribe could be seen across the horizon, the self became both company and canvas. On one plateau, archaeologists uncovered a cave where walls glimmer faintly with red ochre and manganese. At first glance, the markings seemed random, but under ultraviolet light, a rhythm emerged. Series of vertical streaks grouped in repeating counts. Some interpret them as tallies, others as proto-writing. Yet their arrangement mirrors something else. rainfall records from the same epoch. Could it be that these ancient hands were measuring not possessions, but days of sun? Perhaps each stroke marked a reprieve, a record of brightness between storms. If so, the first calendars were not made to measure time, but hope. In the same highlands, sediment cores reveal bursts of microscopic pollen from new flowering species. Their sudden appearance coincides with the rain's retreat. Botanists note that such rapid diversification can occur only under conditions of stress, followed by abundance. The biological equivalent of awakening from a long sleep. For 2 million years, the planet had been dreaming in water. Now it was remembering color. Still, the return of light did not mean peace. The exposed lands baked under their new freedom. Rivers that had swelled for centuries now starved. The first true droughts appeared, and with them, the first migrations in search of rain. What had once been a prison became a memory worth chasing. Entire species began to wander toward vanished clouds, tracing the ghosts of weather across continents. The instinct for pilgrimage, the pull toward what once sustained us, may have begun here. Some anthropologists suggest that the human fascination with islands, mountains, and lost lands originates from this epoch. The myth of Eden, of Atlantis, of Shambhala. Each may echo the memory of those temporary sanctuaries that rose during the last pluvial retreats. For countless generations, our ancestors looked up through thinning mist and saw salvation in the shape of land. Those shapes became symbols, then stories, then myths. What had once been refuge became heaven. In geological terms, these intervals were brief, perhaps only a few tens of thousands of years each. Yet they redefined the rhythm of life. The alternation between flood and drought became the metronome of evolution, pulsing through everything that followed. The ability to plan, to anticipate scarcity, to imagine the unseen, all of it may trace back to those oscillating shores. When the world fractured, foresight became the new survival. Even now, the descendants of those islands tell the same lesson. The Galapagos, the Seychelles, Madagascar, the Afar Triangle, all bear witness to the creativity of separation. Darwin once wrote that isolation is the engine of novelty, but he could not have known how deep that truth ran. It was not just islands that dreamed of light. It was the light that dreamed of islands. In the stillness after the rain, ecosystems became experiments. On one island, tortoises grew massive, their shells mirroring the domes of clouds they no longer saw. On another, birds lost color entirely, adapting to fog's monochrome palette. The rain had sculpted creatures of reflection, and now they adapted to brightness as if relearning language. The earth was no longer one world but a choir of dialects, each speaking survival in a different tongue. To study this age is to confront a paradox. That fragmentation can create unity. Across oceans and mountains, the same instincts reappeared: symmetry in design, rhythm in movement, tenderness toward light. It's as if the planet, broken into pieces, began to dream of reconnection. Evolution's diversity was not division but rehearsal, a practice for the eventual weaving back together of species, continents, and minds. The paleoclimatologist Anne Deacon once wrote, "Every retreat of water is a rehearsal for language." She meant that communication begins in absence, the need to cross distance, to reach what is no longer near. Those highlands, isolated and humming with new life, were the first syllables of the world's long sentence. The sound of the wind returning over the empty basins may have been the first grammar, a vibration connecting what the rain had separated. But there's another way to see it. Perhaps isolation wasn't the start of communication, but the beginning of self-awareness. To stand alone on an island and look toward endless gray is to feel the edges of existence. The creatures that lived there, sensing their boundaries, began to invent themselves. And when the rain finally ended, they carried that invention outward, spreading identity across the world. Every civilization we know, from Sumer to the Andes, carries echoes of this topology. Highlands revered, islands sanctified, water as border and bridge. It's a geography written into our mythic DNA. The story of salvation rising from the flood didn't begin with humanity. It began with the earth remembering how to lift its head above the sea. The islands of light became laboratories of future worlds, but also their warning. For when the next rain comes, and it always comes, those sanctuaries will be the first to drown. Evolution, after all, is not progress, but rehearsal. And every rehearsal must end. Perhaps that is why we still seek islands, still build towers and cities that rise above tide lines, still chase altitude as if it could save us. Somewhere in the marrow of our species, a whisper remains from that age of separation. Stay where the light first touched the land. But the light too remembers. It will return, and it will vanish again. And the islands, those dreaming fragments of survival, will wait for the next dawn that isn't theirs to keep. Every river keeps a secret under its skin. Even the quietest stream hides a story of what it once drowned. When the long age of rain finally subsided, the water began to retreat, not in a rush, but in a sigh, curling back into basins that had forgotten their names. The continents emerged like memories resurfacing from dream. But where rivers ran, bones waited. Beneath those calm surfaces lay the remains of worlds that no one would ever fully recover. It began with an accident. A team of geologists surveying the Narmada Valley in central India struck their spades into what they thought was sediment hardened by drought. The soil was dense, mineral-rich, and strangely brittle. When the first skull fragment appeared, they assumed it belonged to an extinct animal. Only later, under the lens of a field microscope, did they realize the truth. The bone was unmistakably human, thick, heavy, ancient beyond reckoning. Around it, layers of river silt held traces of iron oxide, pollen, and microscopic shells. Everything about the find whispered of water. It was as if a civilization had been quietly laid to rest beneath a moving mirror. The Narmada discovery was not alone. In Africa's Lake Turkana Basin, paleontologists found similar secrets. Human tools buried alongside fish vertebrae, hippo bones, and ancient shells. In some layers, volcanic ash sealed the fossils like glass. In others, floods had rearranged them into strange tableaux. Humans and animals sharing the same fossilized gesture, as though caught in a single eternal wave. The rivers were not merely destroyers. They were archivists. They did not erase. They rearranged. Across continents, scientists began to notice a pattern. Wherever ancient riverbeds lay, traces of habitation followed. Charred wood, pigment residue, fragments of hearthstone, even pollen from cultivated grasses. And yet, each of these sites ended abruptly, with no signs of battle, famine, or exodus. Only mud, only silence. It was as if entire communities had been swallowed mid-sentence. The pattern suggested something haunting. Civilization may have risen and fallen more than once, long before the histories we can name. But when the evidence reappears, it is fragmentary. Some bones warped by pressure, others half-dissolved. Carbon dating tells a story too inconsistent to be trusted. Layers overlap like dreams. Scientists disagree, and rightly so. The sediment record is a palimpsest, a manuscript, written, washed, and rewritten again. Still, Even skepticism carries wonder. For every artifact that survives, there are thousands lost in the slow churn of the earth. How many chapters of our origin dissolved before we ever learned to read them? To read, in the lower reaches of the Nile, divers have discovered megalithic stones arranged in rough circles on a riverbed. They could be natural formations. They could be astronomical markers drowned by shifting channels. When sunlight pierces the water at certain angles, those stones align with the rising of Sirius, the same star later worshipped in dynastic Egypt. Coincidence or continuity? The question divides scholars. But beneath the weight of centuries, the distinction between coincidence and inheritance begins to blur. Perhaps memory itself behaves like sediment, layered, compressed, and eventually crystallized into belief. Further south, near the shores of Lake Malawi, archaeologists uncovered footprints preserved in hardened clay, a single line of steps curving away from what was once a floodplain. Some prints are human, others animal, all pressed within hours of one another. The pattern suggests urgency, but not panic, movement toward higher ground. Then the track vanishes, swallowed by what had become the lakebed. If those steps belonged to ancestors, they were not running from the storm. They were following it. Migration may have been our species' oldest ritual. Not escape, but communion with change. Even in the stillness of fossilization, the rivers tell of movement. The orientation of bones follows the direction of flow, as though time itself had a current. Hydrologists studying these layers speak of fluvial sorting, the process by which floods organize matter by weight and shape. But when viewed through another lens, the effect is poetic. The rain that erased fire now arranged memory. It sculpted order out of death. Perhaps that is why so many ancient cultures came to see rivers as gods. In Mesopotamia, the Euphrates was a living being, its floods both punishment and mercy. In China, the Yellow River was the pulse of creation. Even in the Andes, the Inca described the Urubamba as the vein of the world. None of these metaphors are coincidences. They are inheritances from the age when rivers decided what survived. The floodplains were also forges. Minerals carried from volcanic highlands mixed with organic sediment, forming clays rich in life. Some scientists suggest that amino acids, precursors of living cells, can self-assemble in such mud under fluctuating temperatures. If true, then the same process that buried civilizations may once have created them. The water that destroyed also invented. To hold a fossil from that time is to touch condensation turned to stone. Every ridge, every mineral vein, is a memory of turbulence. Some fossils contain fine concentric rings that reveal not years, but floods. Each one a heartbeat of an ancient river. When sliced thin and placed under polarized light, these fossils shimmer like the inside of seashells. It's as though the rain, tired of falling, decided to preserve its own reflection. And yet, for all its patience, the earth forgets easily. Rivers shift course, silt builds upon silt, and soon the past is buried beneath anonymity. Only the accidental, a landslide, an earthquake, a curious scientist brings the buried world back to surface. But when it does, the revelation feels intimate, almost intrusive, like opening a stranger's diary. We call it archaeology, but it is really an act of resurrection. Each discovery is a negotiation between water and time. What the rain erased, the drought reveals. At the Turkana site, a small carving was found, a piece of obsidian shaped like a teardrop, too deliberate to be natural, too simple to decode. Some see it as a pendant. Others believe it was a tool. But its symmetry suggests another purpose. Perhaps it was an imitation of the raindrop itself, a talisman to control or remember it. The maker must have held it between fingers, turning it in the faint light, understanding that everything precious eventually falls. Beneath the rivers, then, lies more than sediment. There lies intention. Every drowned object carries a fragment of longing. The rain had been the destroyer of continuity, yet life, stubborn and imaginative, kept finding ways to mark itself against oblivion. Even without language, existence kept leaving messages. Ripples on cave walls, handprints on stone, the geometry of bones aligned by current. Modern satellite imagery reveals ghost rivers everywhere. Under deserts, under cities, even under the oceans themselves. These ancient channels still hum faintly with magnetism, their shapes preserved in gravitational anomalies. To read them is to realize how much of Earth's memory remains unseen. We live upon palimpsests, walking unknowingly across the graves of vanished rain. And if memory can hide in rock, perhaps it can hide in us too. Geneticists tracing humanity's dispersal have found evidence of population bottlenecks aligning with the same pluvial intervals. We carry within ourselves the watermark of survival, the imprint of floods endured. The way our species clings to coastlines, builds near rivers, listens for rain at night. It's more than instinct. It's nostalgia for a time when water decided everything. The rivers still whisper their history, but quietly now, under the hum of cities and the static of machines. Each current is a page still being written, each delta a mouth retelling the same story in new tones. The bones beneath them no longer move, yet their shape guides the flow. Life continues to travel along the memory of what it buried. And perhaps that is the strange mercy of water. It never truly lets go. It carries what it destroys, keeps what it loses, folds everything into motion until forgetting becomes another form of remembrance. The rivers are still writing us. We just haven't learned how to read what they're saying. Every flood leaves a wound that flowers. Long after the deluge receded and the bones settled into silence, something smaller, quieter, and far more patient remained. Seeds, infinitesimal, unassuming, had endured what no creature could. Entombed in silt and darkness, they waited. For centuries, for millennia, for light they could not remember but somehow still believed in. Modern botanists call them resurrection seeds, and their fossils appear like tiny spirals in ancient sediments. Some, recovered from the bottoms of vanished lakes, are still viable. When touched by moisture, they unfold as though time were only another kind of weather. In them lies the oldest secret of survival, the ability to become silence without ceasing to exist. When the 2 million years of rain began to relent, the earth transformed from a mirror into a garden. Not immediately, not cleanly. The first sprouts pushed through mud the color of rust. Pollen returned to the air, fragile and uncertain. The planet smelled of iron and renewal. It was an unfamiliar perfume, the scent of rot becoming soil. Scientists studying fossilized pollen grains from East African cores discovered something astonishing. The earliest vegetation to reappear was not the kind that thrives in warmth or abundance, but species that specialize in stress. Desert grasses, salt-tolerant sedges, and plants capable of surviving months without light. They emerged not because the world was ready, but because they were. The rain had not chosen them. They had chosen endurance. In the geological record, their arrival appears as a green whisper between gray epochs. It's not a sudden bloom, but a slow pulse. And within that pulse, a deeper story hides. These plants developed biochemical mechanisms still unmatched in nature. proteins that protect DNA from dehydration, pigments that shield against ultraviolet radiation, enzymes that rebuild cell walls after collapse. In essence, they learned how to die without dying. The same principle that governs their survival now governs ours. Human cells contain repair sequences that activate under stress, relics of those same botanical ancestors. On a microscopic level, every breath we take is an echo of a seed remembering how to wake. Ancient floodplains across Africa and Asia became laboratories of rebirth. The lakes that had suffocated life now served as wombs for it. When the water withdrew, it left behind beds of nutrient-rich sediment. The first post-pluvial plants germinated in these margins. Neither land nor sea. A liminal realm of becoming. These borderlands taught evolution flexibility. Roots learned to breathe air. Leaves learned to drink fog. From that uncertainty grew the diversity that would one day color the world. There's poetry hidden in that science. The concept of latency, the seed wading through darkness, mirrors something profoundly human. Our myths, too, are seeds buried beneath forgetting, waiting for context to bloom again. Every story of resurrection, from Osiris to Christ, from the phoenix to spring itself, carries the same genetic memory. Life enduring absence. Even ancient art preserves the metaphor. On cave walls in the Sahel and Anatolia, faded spirals painted in red ochre accompany images of rain and plants. Archaeobotanists believe these spirals represent seed pods or cycles of regrowth. But to the imagination they look like galaxies, suggesting that early humans saw no boundary between Earth and cosmos. Germination was not merely a biological event. It was the echo of creation itself. In some sense, the Earth never stopped germinating. Even now, in the tundra of Siberia, seeds tens of thousands of years old have been coaxed to life. In Israel, a date palm from the time of Herod sprouted again after 2 millennia in dormancy. In Antarctica, moss, buried beneath ice for centuries, reawakened after a single week of light. The planet's patience surpasses our comprehension. Nothing truly ends. It simply waits for the right temperature of memory. Paleoclimatologists have a term for this delayed vitality: viable latency. It refers to the span between dormancy and resurrection, a temporal bridge that defies decay. Philosophically, it describes more than seeds. It describes civilization. Every culture, after all, is a germination of memory after silence, a recollection that becomes visible when conditions allow. If we extend that thought, perhaps evolution itself is a rhythm of waiting. Each mass extinction, each cataclysm, each long reign does not destroy life. It teaches it to pause. The genome becomes a library of responses to loss. Every cell carries a record of catastrophe survived. But what did it feel like? That first sprouting after the endless wet. Imagine standing on a plain where the air still drips with mist, where the ground is soft enough to swallow footprints whole. The first blades of green pierce through, trembling under their own fragility. The sunlight, pale and unfamiliar, glances off them like gold. Around you silence, true silence, holds its breath. For the first time in millions of years, the rain stops. The planet exhales, and in that exhale, life answers. The seeds do not rise alone. With them come insects, the early pollinators, their wings glinting like fragments of the lost sky. Frogs emerge from mud, birds from fog, and soon the still world trembles again with motion. It is not the chaotic abundance of paradise. It is something quieter, more deliberate. A cautious miracle. In this fragile interval, a new equilibrium forms. The roots that once drowned now anchor. The rain becomes rhythm instead of sentence. For the first time, seasons return. Cycles of bloom and rest, life and dormancy begin to shape the planet's heartbeat. Time, which had been indistinguishable from water, learns to count again. From this rebirth comes one of the most mysterious events in the fossil record: the sudden proliferation of grasslands. Around 2 million years ago, vast prairies began to spread across Africa and Asia, replacing swamp and forest alike. These open plains provided the stage for a new kind of creature, one that could run, plan, and see far. The grass did not just feed the future, it framed it. Every civilization that would ever rise was predicated on the work of those small green architects. And still, beneath every field, the old seeds sleep. Some will never wake. Some will rise when we are gone. Each carries the blueprint of persistence, the refusal to end. To study them is to confront our own mortality and its antidote. Because what the seed teaches is not just survival, it teaches forgiveness. The rain was not enemy, but condition. Without drowning, there would have been no soil. Without darkness, no growth. In a sense, every human act of hope, planting, writing, remembering, is a seed gesture. We bury potential and trust it will return. The rhythm is the same: surrender, silence, resurrection. The rain may have ceased 2 million years ago, but its lesson still governs the pulse of existence. Modern climatology warns that rain will come again. Long, unrelenting, global. Ice is melting. Cycles are shifting. Yet perhaps the future, too, will rely on this old design. Maybe the planet will teach us once more to lie dormant, to endure, to wait for the next calm. If we are seeds, then extinction is only dormancy in another form. Under the soil, beneath the weight of time, nothing truly dies. There is only the slow translation of memory into possibility. And maybe, somewhere in the quiet darkness where the rain once sang, another kind of seed is waiting. Not of grass or tree, but of thought. The one that remembers how to begin again. The sea remembers differently. Where rivers carried away the story of rain, the ocean learned to forget through movement. Every wave is an act of erasure. Every tide a revision. During the long age of storms, the ocean swelled with fresh water until even salt itself began to vanish. For the first time since the planet cooled, the sea lost its taste. Marine isotopic records show it clearly. A massive dilution event, global and simultaneous. Layers of planktonic shells retrieved from the deep Atlantic and Pacific tell the same story through their chemistry. Their ratios of oxygen isotopes suggest that entire oceans freshen by as much as 3%, enough to alter density, to slow currents, to change the planet's temperature rhythm. Oceanographers call it a salinity crisis, though the term feels almost moral, as if the sea had suffered amnesia. Imagine that vast forgetting. Coral reefs used to balance and rhythm, starved under the imbalance. Their skeletons dissolved faster than they could grow, leaving fields of white ghost architecture beneath the surface. Fish populations migrated without pattern, chasing minerals that no longer drifted where they should. The great conveyor belts of circulation, the Gulf Stream, the Kuroshio, the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, shuddered like slowed heartbeats. The sea's pulse faltered. It was not just physical change, it was metaphysical. The salt of the ocean is not merely chemistry, it is history. Every grain of sodium chloride began once as rock, carved by wind and rain, carried to the sea by rivers that once bore mountains on their backs. To lose that salt was to lose memory itself, to dissolve the conversation between land and ocean. The planet, briefly, forgot how to taste itself. And yet, in that strange neutrality, life endured. Deep within the newly freshened waters, microorganisms adapted faster than any creature of air or soil. They began to rewrite photosynthesis, learning to harvest dimmer light to feed on trace minerals invisible to older forms. The descendants of those microbes still live today in the Baltic and the Black Sea. Half salt, half fresh, perfect symbols of transition. They are the children of the moment when the Earth's bloodstream changed composition and had to heal. But this healing was not gentle. The rain that had flooded continents poured sediment into the oceans, choking reefs and bays. Whole deltas collapsed beneath the weight of their own fertility. The seafloor, once a map of ancient calm, became chaos. In those deposits, geologists find thick bands of green-gray clay, rich in organic matter, evidence of dead algae, drowned forests, rotted plankton. These sapropal layers mark the time when the sea became both womb and grave. One layer, formed roughly 2 million years ago, runs uninterrupted from the Mediterranean to the Arabian Sea. Its uniformity implies a global event, a synchronized flooding of memory. Scientists can't agree on the cause. Some blame tectonic shifts that closed ocean gateways. Others point to the melting of polar ice from the previous interglacial period. But among those who study the chemistry closely, there is an unspoken awe at how perfectly it aligns with the timeline of humanity's emergence. While the sea forgot its salt, something on land remembered its mind. Perhaps the two are connected. The ocean's quieting might have calmed the atmosphere, dimming storms, allowing early humans to explore new coasts and estuaries. The first shells found strung as ornaments in prehistoric graves come from this period. To touch a seashell, then, was to touch miracle. The residue of an ocean still relearning salinity, solidified into art. The earliest jewelry on Earth is also its first elegy. Somewhere along these freshened coasts, people must have noticed that the sea's edge was moving. Beaches appeared where none had been, then vanished again as if the ocean were breathing. For them, it wasn't climate, it was mood. The ocean was alive, temperamental, haunted. They built shelters high, carved offerings into driftwood, traced fish in ochre on stone. The line between worship and survival blurred, as it often does when the world itself becomes unpredictable. We know this because the ocean kept its own version of confession. In the sediments off Oman and Crete, magnetic grains preserve alignment from the time when the Earth's magnetic field reversed, a phenomenon that occurred near the end of the pluvial cycle. The magnetic north flipped south, and for a moment, the compass of the planet spun freely. To live then would have been to see skies filled with aurora, the upper atmosphere glowing blood red as charged particles danced across the equator. The rain had taken the world into shadow. Now the magnetosphere painted it with fire. When the field stabilized and the storms finally broke, the seas began to shrink, condensing into their modern forms. Salt returned, slowly, grain by grain, washed down from resurrected mountains. The ocean's memory rebooted, but its forgetting left a mark on everything that lived within it. The shells of marine organisms changed composition, incorporating trace elements of the flood. Their descendants still carry that impurity, a chemical signature of ancient sweetness. Even now, when scientists taste deep-sea water from those regions, they note faint deviations from normal salinity, like the aftertaste of an old dream. It's tempting to think the ocean's amnesia was punishment, but nature does not punish. It balances. By absorbing so much fresh water, the sea slowed the carbon cycle, cooled the air, and gave land a chance to rest. What seemed like drowning was restoration. The planet had learned to regulate itself through loss. In myth, The sea often represents chaos, but the chaos of that age was discipline. The rain that poured into the ocean wasn't waste. It was a reminder that even the vast must yield. Salt had ruled for eons. Rain humbled it. The same humility would later echo in human stories. Gods who flood the world to teach reverence. Heroes who sail to find forgotten shores. Cultures that measure purity by water's clarity. Behind every ritual of cleansing, there is the memory of the ocean's forgetting. Today, oceanographers measure salinity to the 1,000th decimal. Yet none can fully explain why the sea remains slightly fresher than it should be. Some speculate that the last remnants of that ancient dilution still circulate in abyssal depths, trapped in cold currents that take millennia to surface. If that's true, then somewhere in the darkness below, the rain of 2 million years still drifts. Slow, unseen, incorruptible. Perhaps that is why the ocean continues to fascinate us. It is the planet's unconscious, the archive of what can't be remembered, but refuses to disappear. Every wave carries traces of that old transformation, each tide an echo of the time when salt and memory parted ways. And maybe, one day, when the rain returns in earnest, the ocean will begin its forgetting again. The taste of the sea will soften. The reefs will fade. Life will retreat to the margins and wait, as it always has. For now, though, when we walk along the shore and feel the sting of salt on our skin, we are tasting continuity. The sea remembering how to be itself again. The bitterness is only history made tangible. The residue of what it means to survive by forgetting. The ocean forgot its name once. And in doing so, it gave the world a chance to learn its own. Somewhere amid the shifting lakes and the quiet return of salt, a shadow began to rise. It was small at first, indistinct. A new species watching from the edges of the deluge. 2 million years of rain had remade the earth, and now it began remaking the mind. The human shadow appeared not as a conqueror, but as a listener. The storms had carved patience into its bones, caution into its reflexes. The creature that would one day call itself human was born not from strength, but from weather. In the Rift Valley, along the banks of rivers still heavy with sediment, fossils mark this arrival. Skull fragments, tools of chipped obsidian, traces of ash. They belong to Homo erectus, the upright wanderer, the child of rain. In these remains, scientists see a species caught between water and light, its body built for walking long distances across newly opened plains, its mind still haunted by the rhythm of falling skies. The fossil record shows a sudden expansion of territory, a migration outward from the old flooded heartlands. But migration is only the visible half of evolution. The invisible half is memory. The pluvial ages had trained the mind to expect change. Every horizon was temporary, every shelter borrowed. So when the clouds lifted and the world widened, this new intelligence did not settle. It explored. The very instability that had crushed older species became the human advantage. We learned not to depend on stability, but on movement. Evolution rewarded uncertainty. Geologists studying ancient footprints in the sediments of Ileret, Kenya, have found patterns that differ from earlier hominins. The steps are straighter, more deliberate. The spacing suggests endurance running, a body made not for bursts of speed, but for distance. In a world still wrinkled by receding floods, travel became adaptation. To survive was to wander. To wander was to remember. Each journey required imagination, the ability to picture what lay beyond sight. This was the beginning of abstraction, the quiet birth of speculation. The same rain that had erased maps had forced the mind to create new ones. internal and invisible. The first geography was cognitive. Paths drawn, not in soil, but in thought. It's no coincidence that the earliest evidence of symbolic behavior appears around this time. Carved bone fragments with deliberate grooves, collections of shells carried inland, pigments ground into powder. These were not tools of survival. They were tools of meaning. Perhaps they were talismans, perhaps warnings, perhaps attempts to hold on to what the rain always took away. In either case, they show something unprecedented: the instinct to preserve the invisible. The anthropologist Louis Leakey once wrote that early humans learned to dream while awake. That phrase, poetic as it sounds, is literal. Neuroscientists now believe that the capacity for imagination, our ability to simulate possible futures, evolved as a survival mechanism during climate instability. The storms did not simply shape the body. They sculpted foresight. Under endless rain, you had to predict the sky. In that prediction lay empathy. To read the clouds was to read intention, to sense patterns, moods, warnings. Perhaps that sensitivity extended beyond weather. The same neurons that tracked wind direction and rainfall began to track emotion, movement, tone. Out of meteorology, psychology was born. The sky was the first mirror in which we learned to interpret meaning. Somewhere between those tempests, early humans began to use fire again. Charred bones and ash layers reappear in sediments dated to roughly 1 million years ago. The return of flame was both practical and mystical. To rekindle fire after 2 million years of rain was to reclaim control over chance itself. The storms had tested endurance. Now, light tested memory. Around these fires, language may have begun, not as words, but as rhythm. The crackle of flame, the cadence of rain, the sound of breath between both. Communication was born as imitation of weather. In caves near Lake Victoria, archaeologists found blackened ceilings stained with soot older than any known painting. Beneath them lay stone circles and faint carvings. Some believe they were ritual sites, but ritual is only repetition made sacred. Perhaps these gatherings were simply acts of remembrance, the first storytellers trying to fix experience against forgetting. What did they speak of? Not gods yet, not history, but phenomena. The sound of the sea withdrawing, the return of light, the fear that rain would come again and never end. Every myth that followed may be a continuation of that first story. The tale of surviving too much sky. Genetic studies of mitochondrial DNA show that all modern humans share a common ancestor who lived during this oscillation of wet and dry. She, or someone like her, would have known both abundance and famine, sunlight and flood. Her children spread outward along coastlines, newly exposed by retreating waters, carrying fragments of memory encoded not just in genes, but in behavior. Even today, our species congregates near water as though obeying an ancient pull. Perhaps we are all descendants of shorelines, the threshold where reflection begins. But the rise of humanity also marked a new kind of disappearance. As intelligence grew, the record of the natural world began to thin. Animals that once dominated vanished from the fossil record. The megafauna of Africa and Asia retreated or died. Some say this was predation, others, coincidence. But it's possible that the shift in consciousness itself altered the balance. To imagine is to interfere. To predict is to change the outcome. Humanity's first thought may have been an extinction. The rain had created a species capable of questioning rain itself. It's no wonder that so many early myths describe a quarrel between heaven and earth, gods and mortals, storm and flame. We were born from the quarrel's tension. And though the clouds had begun to clear, the memory of drowning never left us. Even today, every religion, every ritual cleansing, every baptism is a reenactment of that origin, a pact with water to destroy only what we can afford to lose. When the sun finally became constant, the human mind faced something unprecedented. Quiet. No flood, no drought, no endless gray to dictate movement. And in that stillness, anxiety bloomed. The storms had given purpose. The calm gave questions. What now? Why here? The same imagination that saved us from extinction began to invent meaning for its own sake. From survival arose philosophy. There are fossils of footprints near Dmanisi in Georgia, the first clear evidence of humans walking beyond Africa. The prints are shallow, firm, untouched by flood. They mark the beginning of exile. For the first time, our ancestors were leaving not because they must, but because they could. They were exploring absence. Migration had become curiosity. That impulse, the hunger for elsewhere, still defines us. To walk away from the rain was to walk toward selfhood. Every step carried within it a dual inheritance. The body shaped by water, the mind shaped by wonder. We had survived the storm, but in doing so, we became its echo. The rhythm of rain remained in language, in heartbeat, in the cycles of breath and sleep. The earth had stopped raining, but we had not, and maybe that's why, even now, humanity listens for weather like confession. The thunder rolling across mountains, the first drop on a window, the scent of soil after drought. They awaken something ancient, a pulse older than civilization. Beneath our technologies, our migrations, our architectures, we remain children of rainfall, wanderers of water. The human shadow emerged not to dominate the world, but to remember it, to bear witness for everything the rain had erased. That is why we tell stories, why we look backward through time, because our first inheritance was lost. And though the sun finally rose steady, somewhere in the mind of the species, clouds still gather. We are the descendants of survival, and of longing for the sound that taught us to begin. The shadow of that sound never left. It walks beside us, still listening. Fire returned quietly. It did not roar or conquer. It whispered its way back into the world through the trembling hands of creatures who had once feared it. The earth had dried enough for sparks to live again. And somewhere, on a plateau ringed by the skeletons of long-dead trees, lightning struck and did not die. Smoke rose, thin and almost ashamed, curling into a sky that had only recently learned color. The reign of rain was over, and light had come back not as storm, but as memory. Archaeologists studying the ash layers in Lake Baringo's basin call this the charcoal horizon. To the naked eye, it looks like a streak of black between pale bands of clay, but under a microscope, it glitters faintly. Tiny fragments of carbon, fossils of combustion. These particles mark the first time in hundreds of thousands of years that the planet held fire again. They appear almost everywhere at once, scattered through sediments across Africa, Asia, even parts of Europe. It is as if flame itself had migrated, searching for the warmth it once knew. The return of fire changed everything. It changed the taste of food, the smell of air, the pace of night. The humans who tamed it were not inventing but remembering, reawakening an old partnership buried under eons of rain. Flame dried their tools, hardened their shelters, and, more importantly, reshaped their sense of time. For the first time, light could exist after sunset. The world had nights now, not just darkness. Anthropologists often write that fire created civilization, but in truth, it recreated it. Every spark was an act of rebellion against the age that came before, a refusal of endless water. When early humans gathered around their first controlled fires, they were not merely warming themselves. They were defying a 2 million-year inheritance of cold and wet. That defiance became ritual. Evidence from Wonderwerk Cave in South Africa, charred bones, burnt plant matter, shows repeated use of fire in the same spot over generations. Such repetition means intention. Someone remembered where flame had lived and returned to that place again and again, keeping vigil. The fire pit became a shrine, a continuity between ancestors and descendants. In the dim flicker, eyes met across time. At some point, words followed. Language grew in the shadow of flame. It is no coincidence that in so many languages, light and knowing are the same word. Lucer, illumination, enlightenment. To speak was to create brightness between minds. Fire turned silence into dialogue, darkness into story. The sparks that rose from those early hearths were the first metaphors, the earliest attempts to say, "We remember." Still, the earth did not entirely surrender its dampness. Rain lingered at the edges of firelight, a ghost pressing its face to the window of new warmth. You can almost feel it in the archaeological record. The alternating layers of ash and mud, light and shadow. The world had entered a rhythm, a breathing between flame and water. That rhythm would shape everything that followed. Some fires burned too fiercely. The same winds that once carried rain now carried embers, and vast swaths of forest turned to smoke. Volcanic dust mingled with carbon haze, creating sunsets that stained the horizon crimson. Yet even this destruction bore seeds. Fire unlocked nutrients long trapped in soil. Grasses returned, faster and stronger. The savannas of East Africa, the cradle of humanity, were born from this renewal. We are, in the most literal sense, children of ash. In those grasslands, humans learned something new. Community around continuity. Unlike rain, fire required tending. It demanded cooperation, vigilance, trust. A single spark could die if neglected, or spread uncontrollably if ignored. The social brain evolved around that delicate balance. To keep flame alive was to invent responsibility. It's possible that morality itself, the awareness of consequence, was born from sitting in the circle of light, watching shadows move on the walls. There's a painting in Chauvet Cave in France. Two horses facing each other, their outlines overlapping as if caught in motion. Above them, a soot stain from an ancient torch still clings to the ceiling. That stain is older than any language we know, and yet it speaks. The people who painted there understood something sacred about illumination, that light is temporary and therefore precious. Every stroke of ochre was an act of resistance against extinction. Scientists examining residues from early torches found fat from animal bone mixed with ash, a primitive oil lamp. To create it, someone had to understand transformation, the conversion of death into light. It was chemistry, but also ritual. The Earth's first negotiation with loss. As fire spread, so did myth. Cultures far apart began to tell the same story, of beings who stole light from the gods, who carried flame in hollow reeds, who hid embers in their hands. Prometheus in Greece, Maui in Polynesia, Agni in India, all versions of a single memory encoded in different tongues. The human brain, still shaped by 2 million years of rain, understood light as forbidden. We weren't meant to hold it. We took it anyway. And yet, what the myths call theft may have been recognition. Fire had always been part of the planet's cycle. It was the hidden twin of rain, the purifier after the deluge. The same lightning that split clouds had always carried both. Humans were merely intermediaries, conduits between the two elements. In our hands, fire became thought. To this day, the brain's electrical impulses mimic the flicker of flame. Neural activity occurs in waves, bursts, pauses, bursts again. Consciousness itself moves like a candle in wind. Perhaps we carry fire not just in culture, but in the architecture of perception. The rain shaped endurance. The flame shaped awareness. Between them, intelligence found balance. Still, balance is fragile. Each time light conquers shadow, the shadow waits for return. After the long rain, the planet's ecosystems flourished, but the memory of water lingered in them like grief. The humidity that rose from jungles, the monsoons that cycle each year, the dew that coats grass at dawn, all are remnants of that age when the world wept endlessly. Fire did not erase water. It gave it context. Modern climatologists note that charcoal residues in sediment cores increase sharply before major evolutionary leaps in human behavior. Agriculture, metallurgy, urbanization, all coincide with new waves of burning. It seems every advancement arrives with a spark. But progress, like fire, consumes as it creates. Perhaps that is the price of awakening. To destroy what shelters us so that we may see further. There is a quiet irony in how we live now. We command flame in ways our ancestors could never imagine. We burn fuel beneath oceans, ignite stars in machines, mimic lightning in circuits. Yet each innovation repeats the same gesture that began on a rainy plateau. The reaching of hands toward warmth. Fire remains our oldest addiction. The need to see what hides in the dark. In that addiction lies our inheritance. Every time we strike a match or stare into a screen, we perform an ancient rite, calling light from forgetting. But each spark also reminds us of what it can take away. The rain's lesson was endurance. The flame's lesson is restraint. When the first dry winds swept across the savannas and the last echoes of the pluvial age faded, early humans looked up at stars that had been invisible for eons. The sky glittered with unfamiliar constellations, reflections of fires below. For the first time, the heavens looked back. And maybe, in that moment, humanity understood the symmetry. That the light above and the light within were the same. Fire was not the end of the rain's story, but its transformation. Water taught life to endure. Flame taught it to remember. And somewhere, deep in the earth's record, ash and clay still lie side by side. Proof that survival was never a matter of choice between elements, but the ability to live between them. The reign of rain ended in smoke, but from that smoke rose a mind bright enough to wonder whether it ever truly ended at all. The water still falls somewhere. Not here, perhaps. Not where our eyes can see. But deep in the forgotten corners of the planet, the rain continues. It falls in caverns beneath Antarctica, in clouds of mist rising from the Mariana Trench, in slow drizzles across the dark side of mountains no one has named. The long storm never truly ended. It merely withdrew, retreating to the margins like an old god who knows the world no longer believes in it. Modern satellites record strange anomalies, microclimates of perpetual moisture, where clouds never disperse. Over the Amazon's heart, over the Congo's deep interior, over the Pacific gyres, regions that breathe their own weather, recycling vapor endlessly. Scientists call them self-sustaining cells, but the phrase feels too sterile for something so ancient. They are echoes of that 2 million-year deluge, remnants of the sky's long grief. When you watch footage of these places, drones hovering above clouds that rise like living things, you can almost sense the old rhythm beneath the data. The pulse that once drowned continents still beats faintly here. It's as if the rain, tired of falling everywhere, chose a few secret sanctuaries to remember itself. And perhaps, in its memory, something else endures. Deep within those perpetual rains, researchers have discovered microbial life forms unlike anything known. Organisms that thrive without sunlight, feeding on minerals carried by mist. Their DNA bears traces of extremophils found in deep ocean vents, suggesting a lineage unbroken since the age of endless water. They are time travelers, small and indifferent, carrying in their cells the oldest weather. To think that life might still be living inside the planet's memory of flood is to realize how little has truly changed. We live in the aftermath of rain, but the aftermath is only another form of rain, the pause between its breaths. Even the deserts, those emblems of dryness, still contain invisible rivers flowing beneath them, aquifers older than civilization. The Sahara, once a sea, still exhales moisture every night. The rain that shaped us has not gone. It hides in stone, in roots, in us. Every drop we drink has fallen before. It is the same water, endlessly cycling, carrying within it the chemical ghosts of ancient storms. In your blood right now flows hydrogen that once fell on old device plains, oxygen that condensed in clouds over Turkana's lakes. The rain never left the world. It became the bloodstream of everything alive. The scientists who study climate cycles warn that the rhythm may soon return. The planet's tilt shifts by degrees too small to notice, but the consequences ripple forward. Glaciers melt, humidity rises, oceans warm, and the sky begins to gather itself again. They predict new pluvial epochs, perhaps not in centuries but decades. The rain will come back. The question is not if, but how we will remember ourselves when it does. For modern civilization, rain is background, something managed, channeled, commodified. We build walls to keep it out, pipelines to move it elsewhere. But history whispers another truth. Rain is destiny. It erases what we build, then teaches us to begin again. Our cities may think themselves invulnerable, but every drop against glass is a reminder of how quickly the horizon can blur. The archaeologists who dig into ancient floodplains often speak of humility. They describe uncovering ruins beneath layers of silt, finding tools still held by the hands of clay-cast skeletons. Each discovery is not triumph, but apology. An acknowledgement that the earth has erased more than we will ever know. We study ghosts. One of them said in an interview, "We just don't always realize they're raining on us." And maybe that's the secret the world keeps trying to tell us. That nothing vanishes. It only changes form. The rain became rivers. Rivers became oceans. Oceans became vapor. Vapor became thought. Consciousness itself is condensation. The atmosphere of memory turning into awareness. The mind, like weather, is never still. Even now, when night falls and the world goes quiet, the sound of rain returns to us instinctively. It soothes. It unsettles. It recalls. We call it white noise, but it is anything but blank. It is the background hum of origin. Somewhere deep inside, our bodies still recognize it as home. The steady rhythm tells us, you have survived this before. You can survive it again. When you listen closely, every rainfall contains layers of time. The first drops that hit the roof are the impatient kind, the descendants of the deluge. The slow drizzle that follows carries the patience of seeds. The mist at dawn belongs to the era of silence, when the world learned stillness. The rain speaks in epochs, We just hear it as sound. Writers and mystics have always understood this. The poet Basho called rain the soul's handwriting. Leonardo filled his notebooks with sketches of storms, as if trying to decode consciousness through weather. Even modern physicists, studying chaos theory, return to rainfall as metaphor. The unpredictable pattern that is somehow inevitable. The rain refuses mastery. It demands surrender. Perhaps that is what the planet has been teaching all along. That endurance is not conquest, but participation. The world survived 2 million years of rain not by resisting it, but by letting it pass through everything. Life, in its infinite forms, became porous. The same law holds for us. What we fear as loss is often the moment when we finally become part of what sustains us. In the last century, deep ice cores from Greenland revealed faint traces of atmospheric composition stretching back millions of years. Buried in those frozen layers are the isotopic fingerprints of the pluvial epochs, the same storms that sculpted our ancestors' minds. When melted, those cores release air that hasn't breathed in 2 million years. Scientists describe the sound it makes. A soft hiss, like distant rain. The past exhales through frost. The cycle begins again. If you could hear the planet's heart, perhaps it would sound like rainfall. A pulse, steady but mournful, neither warning nor comfort. The same rhythm that accompanied the first fire, the first seed, the first thought. It continues, indifferent to civilizations, constant beneath our vanishing. The old stories say the rain was punishment. Science calls it climate, but perhaps it was something gentler. The universe teaching its youngest children to be patient, to dissolve and begin again, to remember that permanence is a myth. The deluge was not the end of the world. It was rehearsal for its continuation. Now, as we stand beneath new skies filled with unfamiliar patterns, contrails, satellites, the glow of distant cities, we might ask whether the next rain will be natural or made by us. The distinction may not matter. The earth does not choose its teachers. It only listens. So, if tonight you hear water moving outside your window, pause. That sound has been falling for 2 million years. It has crossed deserts, mountains, and epochs to reach you. In its rhythm lives every creature that has ever learned to endure. It is not the past returning. It is the present reminding you it never left. The rain falls somewhere still. And perhaps that is all the proof we will ever need that the world remembers us, even when we have forgotten ourselves.